Hi everyone, it's Ren here. Welcome to my room, guys. I hope you're well today. Today we're going to be looking at, sort of in a quick fashion, at different models of personality from the traditional Jungian Myers-Briggs approach. We're going to be looking specifically at the model of C.S. Joseph, the model of objective personality, and the model and concept of Voltology, or typing by microexpressions, as a third part of the sequence. Before I move on to this topic, just to remind you that I've written a book on the INFJ type. So if you're really into the INFJ type, and you're likely to be because you're watching my channel, consider buying this book. It's really good. It's available all in the description box down below, all the links to all the Amazon websites, less than $10, ebook, paperback format. If you want to deepen your knowledge of the INFJ, you have the basics covered, but you want to go further, this is the book to get, the Ecstatic Soul. You have any question, you ask me. Right, so I'm making this video somewhat reluctantly, I must admit, because I generally try not to steer clear of controversies, and I know that there's a lot of controversies between different proponents of different models, and those controversies from my perspective are not always fruitful. Sometimes the issue has to do with the ego of certain people. I think that more from a more material viewpoint, the issue sometimes has to do with the fact that these enterprises are also profitable for their owners and developers, and these people have a vested interest in making their system work. But that is also the issue, as we will come to realize very shortly. One issue is, and I'm speaking broadly here, one issue is obviously that the typology as a science, so to speak, is we will say charitably that it's in its infancy at this point, and that it's not become a proper academic discipline, and therefore that it is not really independent. In other words, research that's done in typology is usually, as I said, tied with business interests of the people who produce the models that are criticized or researched. So if you have a scientist is paid by a university or research institute. If they have a theory and the theory is proven wrong, scientists usually is in a position to just admit it's wrong and test another one. If you have articulated your whole business model around a model or a theory that you're putting forward on YouTube and on the internet and having people pay for it, well, you're not going to be willing to admit that your theory is falsified. So here we have, in essence, two of our models, two of our three models that we're discussing, the frameworks of C.S. Joseph and objective personality, that are facing a quandary. Because when it comes to Voltology, I have the impression that the practice of it is fairly democratic, and that the inventor of Voltology, so to speak, is not primarily dictated by the drive to make a profit out of it, and seems pretty open-minded. So I would accept Voltology from this, although it has problems of its own. But definitely in the case of C.S. Joseph and objective personality, you have that problem. And don't underestimate that problem. It's a major problem, because what are you going to do if you're dealing with people who keep trying to update their theory or find answers within the theory to answer questions that seem to make it unstable? Well, Karl Popper, the philosopher Karl Popper, has an answer to this. It's to say that whenever you see that phenomenon happening, you're dealing with pseudoscientists and with pseudoscience. He distinguishes Popper, who's a very respected figure in the philosophy of science, and a very influential figure up to this day, easily one of the most influential, says something quite simple. It says, if your theory is falsifiable, it qualifies as scientific. If your theory is not falsifiable, it qualifies as pseudo-scientific. Now, let's look at the case of C.S. Joseph first of all. I'm not going to spend a whole, massive amount of time, because I feel like C.S. Joseph's reputation is already fairly tarnished. I don't need to beat a dead horse, although I would be happy to see zero people spending money on the typing offers, that he has on his website or his team has. First of all, because it's exorbitantly expensive, and because it's completely off, completely wrong. So I'll pick just two main issues, and to easily show that it's pseudoscientific, wrong, and essentially a scam. You're not going to get your right type by using his methods. So the first issue is the one that has to do with what Pop would call pseudoscience. C.S. Joseph's model, as far as I can tell, is built precisely so that it can answer every possible critique against it. And it can do so in many ways. I'll just pick one way in which it does that in a very clear sense, is that according to C.S. Joseph's model, you don't just have one type, you have several types. And your superego, for example, is imagined to have a type. Now, what's crucial to understand here is that if you have a certain type and your superego has a different type than your core type, the superego is going to have precisely the functions that you do not have in your core type. In other words, if you divide, say, your type and your superego type, you'll have a display of the 8 functions. But if you have a display of the unfunctions, then the theory can be no longer falsified, because regardless of what function you manifest, a C.S. Joseph follower will always be able to say, well, that's because it's your superego doing the talking, or this, or your unconscious, or whatever it is. So basically, it ought to be possible for any theory of personality to be scientific. The only way in which it can be scientific is really if it can be falsified by evidence of a particular person being typed a certain way and then displaying a pattern of function used that gives the lie to that prediction. And when it gives a lie to that prediction, the typical pseudoscientific, the typical non-scientific reaction is to be like, well, then we have to make sure it's true. To be scientific is to be true. It's like, no, like any serious scientist knows that truth is obviously what a scientist aims for, but truth is not what makes a theory scientific. You've had plenty of scientific theories, remarkably powerful scientific theories that are at least partly false. Consider just Newton's theories, for example. They were only falsified, so to speak, in the early 20th century. So it's not like falsity is not what makes a theory non-scientific. It's unfalsifiability, when you cannot even falsify it. When the extra hypotheses made to protect the theory against falsification are built inside the theory to start with. That is exactly what happens when you have a theory that claims to be able to account for any use of any cognitive function for any type. No. If you have an INFJ type, you ought to be able to say, this type, this person is going to use mostly patterns of this, that function. If you notice other patterns, you try to explain it, but in the face of the brute fact, you have to admit that your theory is only partially correct, and that's completely fine, because a scientific model is a simplification of reality, so it will hit situations where its predictions cannot be made true because it's only a simplification. It can still make it very useful, very scientific. Now, let me also use a different line of argument against the C.S. Joseph model, and it's quite simply that like his approach to typing is so idiosyncratic and different from the traditional approach that the fact he keeps the same terms such as INTJ, like same like names for cognitive functions, INTJ, INTP, end up having Brad Pitt typed as an ESTJ, Paris Hilton typed as an INTJ, things like that. Well, the thing is, it's not just because the theory is nonsense or is pseudoscientific, but it's also because it's holding on to terms that apply to a different model, namely the Myers-Briggs model, whilst operating with concepts of those terms that are different, use different terms. But of course, he doesn't want to do that, because otherwise he loses part of his market appeal. You want to be able to tell people that you're typing INTPs, etc., because these are the terms that are known. These are the terms that can attract people. But it's misleading and it leads to conceptual confusion. Now, to just briefly mention objective personality, from what I've heard, one positive aspect of these people is that they are quite open to criticism, and they're fairly open-minded, fairly undogmatic, and they respond politely, and they try to make a case. So I think that's a good thing. My main issue with them is, and I understand it's an ongoing project, it's still an ongoing theory, so I think that that's very important and it's very good. The threat of pseudoscience in their case, I think, comes from the fact that, again, they're claiming to be able to identify all cognitive functions in a single type. They talk about the shadow functions, and sometimes I've seen them type certain individuals by reference to, a showcase of Demon SI or, things like that. And to me, that's nonsense. That's just, again, the best way to fall into pseudoscience, because you can justify anyone being any type and, at any moment with that theory. And you end up having people like Bernie Sanders typed INTP and stuff like that. So that's essentially what I want to say is the main issue. Like, if only they could just get rid of that whole like reliance on shadow functions, keep to the main 4 functions, for example, they keep their theory falsifiable, and then we could still remain on scientific terrain that could, again, like I said, they're continuing to work on their theory and prove it over time. But I really think that, the focus on the shadow functions is just, no matter what the descriptive advantages that you might get from including those shadow functions, they end up making the theory unscientific because you can't falsify it anymore. And to finish with comments on Voltology, I've made videos on Voltology before, so I will not talk too long about it, other than to say it seems that within Voltology, what I like is that it seems to be a particular approach that has spanned different mini schools. Now, some of the schools hate each other, and there's a lot of rivalry between them. And I don't want to get involved in any of that, but it's nevertheless seen from an outsider's perspective, maybe from a broader perspective, the advantage of someone who's not in that kind of community and not amidst the infighting within that community. That the clear advantage I see is that there are still many people doing different things, and despite the fact that they often seem to be yelling at each other, they're still probably impacting each other with work, getting each other to think. So there are disagreements within the Voltology community. That's really good, because it's a sign that there's dialogue and that there's nothing cult-like about the approach of Voltology. The tools were supplied and they're open enough for different particular techniques to be developed, and I think that has great potential, because Voltology can then move toward a more complete system that will answer questions, I think, such as the circularity that I pointed in my previous video, as in, it seems to me that Voltology has a problem with not implicitly relying on a more common sense MBTI understanding of type before they can proceed with the typing by micro expressions, because in the first place, how would you be able to identify what the types are if you don't have the terminology and the conceptual notions available? Another issue with Voltology that you could point out is that by focusing purely on micro expressions, you empty the functions, not so much of the content, because functions by themselves have no content, but of their structure. Like, I think that one of the main ways in which you can pick out function use is by looking at what people are saying. So you do look at the content of what they're saying, and you look at the way in which that content is structured, the grammar of it, the logic of it. Usually that's where you can pick up the function use, what function is being used. It's not the actual words, it's how the words are put together, made to hang together metaphorically, literally, etc., etc. So again, that could be something that Voltology could look at, or at least make room for the possibility that it could be a tool at the service of other models that are more focused on content and structure. And that's all for my thoughts, guys. I would say, pay most attention to objective personality and Voltology. Those have promise, and they have, I think, a future if the people who are pushing the envelope there continue to be listening to the community, engaging with the community, and updating their model to make them as scientific as they can. And I would suggest that you take the C.S. Joseph model with an extreme pinch of salt, and that if you encounter anyone who is tempted to avail of their services, just to warn them that there are a lot of people with a lot of knowledge of typology that consider the whole enterprise to be charlatanesque, to be honest. And that is all I have to say. Consider subscribing, consider giving me a like, and I'll talk to you soon, guys. Ciao.